Hello, I'm Toycat, and what would the European map look like if sea levels dropped by 1,000 meters? The answer is that ferries from the UK to Ireland would get a lot cheaper, Norway would get freakishly large, and Denmark would be split in two. Presumably because they own that island over there, which is separate from the rest of their territory. This is very fun, and the Netherlands is probably the biggest gainer on a percentage basis, but what's shocking to me is the fact that everyone around the Black Sea surprisingly doesn't gain as much as you'd think. Georgia looks basically the same before and after, which tells us the Black Sea is at least a kilometer deep in a shocking amount of its area, and now you know, I guess. Speaking of things you know, this is a map porn video. It is one of my favorite subreddits, and I figured it'd be fun to do a monthly thing where we go through the best of the maps. So we'll start doing that today by going through the second map here. So these are going to be increasing in quality according to the upvote system of Reddit. This one has 6.1 thousand people saying it's awesome because does your nation have the most speakers of the most commonly spoken national language? And it's really interesting here. You can see the difference in, I guess, what you might call colonialism or expansion around the world. But you can see that on the west of the map, we've got countries which do not speak their language as the largest country. And on the east, we largely have the opposite. Obviously, we've got some weird exceptions. Wait, no. For Austria and Switzerland, but not for Germany, right? Because Germany is the biggest. Anyway, so interestingly, you can see that the only countries on the east of the map otherwise are the tiny city-states of Italy, obviously with Italian. We've got Kosovo, which is not the largest country speaking Albanian, because their neighbor does. Then we've got Moldova, because of Romania. And then, of course, we've got Belarus, where I'm guessing the largest number of Belarusian speakers are in Russia, which is very, very interesting. It could also be that, yeah, this is very, very shocking, but otherwise you can probably guess why it is that every other country in this map is not the largest speaker of their national language. And isn't it kind of interesting that being on the west of Europe gives you this big advantage, or I guess if you're Russian you'd say a disadvantage. Their empire just keeps going east because all they have to do is keep exploring more that way, whereas we have to go on a boat for a month to Australia. But anyway, with the important thing said, let's go into this next map, because this is the US-Canada border, which is the longest international border in the world, but here it is overlaid onto Europe. And whoa, yeah, this is interesting in its own right to show you how wide North America is compared to Europe. Honestly, you know, if you consider Europe as going all the way to the Ural Mountains, then it's about the same. I think most people kind of consider Russia to be the emotional cutoff of Europe. So it's interesting to see this, but also I'm going to say that this is useful because it does kind of split Europe into north and south near perfectly, right? So on the east here, like Ukraine, even though Ukraine is Eastern Europe first, I would definitely say they feel more like Northern Europe than Southern Europe. You know, I'm not going on any holidays to Ukraine anytime soon. That's how you define it. I'm definitely being serious here. Whereas if we look at the, you know, like same with like Germany, like they're very serious Europe, whereas France has a little bit of Northern Europe, but is mostly a Southern European country. Paris is a decent dividing line for that. Honestly, this is probably the best way to split Europe into Canada and the United States. And the only place that I guess I'm wrong for this is like Austria, which is slightly to the south here. It feels like it should be Northern Europe, not Southern. But if we think about where this is on the US-Canada border, it's around the Minnesota area, and let's all be honest with ourselves, Minnesota and Michigan, they're definitely Canadian provinces that are just existing inside of the US, and yeah, if you don't think that's okay to say, then you know, something 51st state. It's okay to imply that another part of a country is yours, so this is where half of Africa's GDP comes from, and these 5 countries have the same sized economy as the other 5, and that sounds really shocking until you realize that Ethiopia and Nigeria are the, you know, second and first most populated countries on the continent, so on a population level it sort of makes sense, but what it mostly is North Africa and South Africa are where all the money is in Africa, and or all the economy is, I should say. There's a bunch of minerals and stuff, but turning that into a more functional, buildable economy has been hard for a lot of countries. South Africa's sort of had something, it's kind of declining in some ways, whereas Nigeria and Ethiopia are very much on the up and up, and Algeria has done shockingly well from its you know, its natural wealth too. It's actually managed to turn that into a bit of a you know, a country that more people can enjoy. Egypt is a bit of a wild card here in terms of what's going down, but this map actually isn't surprising to me. I'm almost shocked that like it's only even with these 4 versus these 4. Sorry, these 5 versus the rest of it. I would have guessed that South Africa, Nigeria, and Ethiopia alone should have been very close to the halfway mark, but I guess I'm now shocked the other way. That's the cool thing about these maps. Speaking of the cool thing about these maps, we're going to leave that to the side and instead go into the German election map. And like I mentioned in my video about the German elections, this is one of the most interesting things because of just how clear the East-West split is. Clearly, the winds are blowing around the world right now that the world is looking for rightward governments. You can theorize all sorts of reasons about why that is, but like generally speaking, the right seems to be doing pretty well around the world. But then even in countries where it is doing well, it splits between, do people want like, okay, moderate slash like, like, so do people want the governing right, or do people want the the slightly more populist right? And what's interesting is that seems to depend on income level. The lower your income, the more you don't want to believe the traditional right, and the more you want to believe the the slightly further fringes, if you want to say it that way. And I think this is kind of true about how people view on the left-wing spectrum too. The further down you are, the less franchised you feel like you are, the more you want to have those extreme left-wing viewpoints. Whereas if you actually are feeling like, the system, it's not working perfectly, but at least it's working, then you might go for a more centrist party in that way. Is there some lesson to learn from this? I don't know. But what I do think is interesting is that, yeah, this is, the German election map has moved very far, different direction than I would have guessed. Based on what I was saying. The end of Angela Merkel was so recently, but still, people are looking forward to going back to her party, apparently. Speaking of back to the party, this is how the American Electoral College would look like if it were applied to Europe. And, okay, if we're going to talk about Europe, but if it were American, I think there's only... What we need is, like, some way to signify that I am a European talking about something American. So this is what I'm going to have. Let's put it on. Howdy, folks. I'm Toycat, and I'm gonna talk to you about why the American Electoral College is a bad idea for Europe. So first of all, it's worth mentioning that Russia being in any form of European democracy looks pretty unlikely. But I think more like a very nice number, by the way. I think there is a more serious point here that, like, the way that the European Parliament works is very much not distorted in this way, and I think it kind of fundamentally can't. The way that America guarantees the free minimum electoral representation thing doesn't actually work in Europe because Iceland has 200,000 people, Ireland has about 5 million, if I understand my population figures right, and so if a population that is 25 times bigger gets only 2 more votes, that is the sort of thing that I think might upset a lot of people. I think, being able to, if you take the population of Malta and of Iceland and combine them, they're nowhere near Ireland, but they can outvote them. I think ultimately, though, the population of Europe is very centered into like 4 or 5 major centers, and then kind of isn't everywhere else. Like, the American electoral map is at least mostly evenly distributed. There's like, 10 or 15 states down at the 3 or 4 mark, whereas if you look at the European population, it's like half existing in those very same ones. I think that if you were to try and build a European federation like this and put it together, you would have to merge. You'd have to merge some countries together. Which, I'm just saying, is that a good idea? I don't necessarily think so. But yeah, if you look at the European Parliament as it exists right now, there is actually a bit of a controversy that it does work entirely by population, and I think more people would be upset, for example, that there is a minimum they give to smaller countries, and that the German MEP count is capped relative to its population. That would be really controversial if the European Parliament could actually propose legislation. But as it stands, the European Parliament works in reverse of most governments, where the head figures propose legislation and the European Parliament approves it. It's a strange body. It feels incorrect to most people, and that's why most people don't care about their democracy. But if they did, I would be really upset, like, man, living in the UK, all it takes is like 10 countries which have 1/10 the population getting radicalized by, one strange subsection of the internet, and now we don't get to have this nice thing that we want. Or we have to have this nice thing we don't want. Who's to say which way around it goes? But yeah, I think a European-wide federation, I think you gotta be realistic and, one, not include the Caucasus. Maybe you can include Georgia if you feel like it. I feel like Turkey and Cyprus are also little stretchy over there. But definitely Russia is the part where you say, yeah, I don't know about that. Also probably Belarus at this point. Anyways, Europe's 5 oldest flags. Do you see how I saw 50 in there? I hope you can. Anyway, the 5 oldest flags that are still valid are Scotland from 832, Austria from, it looks like I-230, right? I can't be the only one seeing this. I feel like the O's look like zeros and the I's look like ones. But 1230 is Austria, 1280 is Latvia, Denmark is 1307, and Albania is 1443. I'm genuinely quite shocked to learn that the English or the Welsh flag would be much newer than 1443. What did we have before that? What flag did England have before the cross? The flag of England in 1277, King Edward I. This is an AI overview. They might have used pennants with a red cross on white. Okay, so I mean, it's existed. It just wasn't official. Yeah, English Crusaders may have used it. So the St. George's Cross is when we... Okay, fascinating, apparently. Good job, Scotland, on existing for so much longer. Speaking of existing for longer, we've got the proposed unions of Europe next. So this is weird because Europe as it exists right now is probably at its most fragmented ever in terms of how many countries. Maybe the least fragmented ever in terms of the European Union, but that goes back to a different debate. So, yeah, for the proposed unions of Europe, I think the most... I think Poland, Czechoslovakia, okay, interesting. But, you know, what year was that? Okay, bad news about that one. The Balkan Federation is also interesting, but most of this was already a federation. That's why they have to use what looks like a weird flipped Russian or Netherlandish flag. But nope, that's Yugoslavia. Already took up like half of that, so not that interesting. Benelux, I really am surprised that Benelux doesn't make moves towards being a country, but they don't. I think maybe it is beneficial for Luxembourg in particular to not be a part of another country. But then we've got the Franco-British Union. This is by far the most interesting one. I think the idea, if the UK and France had actually just said, okay, we are combining in effectively made a mini EU way back when, I think we could have better stood up to, like the UK and France got destroyed during World War II and, like basically had to just kind of accept the winds that were blowing from the two forces that were kind of going through Europe. I feel like if the UK and France had like come together in some form of union, one, France wouldn't have lost its territory during World War II and wouldn't have to split into the North-South thing that happened. But, so, there are all sorts of benefits if they'd emerged that way. But also, I feel like we could have had the French Empire nowhere near as fun and useful as the British Empire, and so I feel like if we'd have just been like, instead of being like the current system where we're like going independent is good, we're gonna force these countries to be independent despite having it. If we'd have just been like, what if we did colonialism but good, then we probably would have done colonialism but bad. But it would have been a really interesting try. Okay. Speaking of interesting tries, the fertility rate in Europe, 2024. So as you can see, this is a dire map of Europe. The replacement rate for fertility is 2.1. In reality, you can be somewhere around 2.0, and as long as people aren't dying before they're having children, it will stabilize a population in the long run. But if you're below 2, it means for every possible woman, there is fewer than 2 people being born, and given that only half of the population, or only half the population can give birth, slightly less than, actually, if you think about it, but less than half the population can give birth, and so if during your lifetime lots of those people don't give birth, or they give birth on average to one person, the population declines over time. The only country that's close to the replacement rate is Kosovo. And, some people would say there's no countries close to the replacement rate by that logic. In other words, Europe is not having children. The simple formula on this one, I used to think it was just development. As countries got richer, they tend to have fewer children. This is a big part of it, but the only case where people are rich and still have a lot of children is religiosity. So we need to make a religion that makes people think it's a good idea to have children. And, I don't know, we could make it a big trend. It have to be a social media religion. It have to be one where you have to do basically nothing you don't want, and where we emphasize all the cool bits of having children and none of the downsides. Because there's a lot of downsides. They're very expensive. Because a lot of people will think that like, oh yeah, the problem is that people don't have enough money to raise children. And it's like, we are the richest we have ever been in history. It doesn't feel that way on a moment-to-moment basis because you're like, yeah, I would like to buy all sorts of fun modern luxuries instead of a child. But the fact that you can buy those modern luxuries, and I know you're thinking like, oh, I don't want to buy any Gucci bags to cat. It's like, no. What I mean is literally you can have an infinite source of music thousands of musicians will play their heart out, and you can buy it for a $9.99 subscription. If you want to have the fact that you're watching this on a computer that has access to all the information in the world, or you can buy any book if it happens not to be on there, and it will cost you like $9.99. We have so many consumer goods we can buy. If you measure life purely by consumer goods, we're at the highest living standards. But our desire for those consumer goods outpaces our actual reach for them, and also outpaces our desire for fertility, I would say. No, I think I can't leave it there. I'm going to get a comment being like, no, Toycat, you don't understand my position. So how about you don't understand my position here? I do think that there is a lot of people feel, especially with like inequality, how a lot of people will look and be like, oh, but there's these people having so many more consumer goods. If I just had a Range Rover and a country mansion and could go on 4 holidays a year, then I too would love the idea of having children. But I also feel like, the people with those things are like, oh man, I can't believe I've got like a mini mansion that's 3 hours from the city. I would love to live a little bit closer, and I would love to be able to have a holiday home in Colorado. Once I have those things and I can pay for a full-time nanny, that's when I'll have children. I think there is this like increasing. Maybe that is an effect of inequality. Maybe it's an effect of consumer goods. Maybe it's an effect of lack of religiosity. Or even you could say it's a network effect. If all your friends have children, you want children. If none of your friends have children, I don't want to be the one person I know that has children, or a child. That would suck. Also, yeah, the number of children you want probably goes down. I've seen people with one child, and it looks like it's actually like, not a terrible time. You see people with free childs. That's the word. Free childs, and it looks really awful for them. Speaking of free childs, India holds all of these countries' population in that space. I'm shocked. Every time I see that one state in India has a population the size of the US. The US is the 4th most populated, no, maybe 3rd most populated country by itself, and it's this tiny little area of India. Shocking, every time. The transatlantic slave trade uprooted millions. That is true. Do you ever think about how wild it is that if you picture someone from the Caribbean, you picture someone from an entirely different continent? It's already wild that we do that with like, Australia or, North America. But it's wilder that that happens in the Caribbean because, their people were sold to our people and then we moved them across the world. And so we have moved culture. I guess it's kind of like the same, like moving culture when you choose to do it is one thing. But like the fact that we effectively forcibly relocated people, I don't know, like people act like there's only like 5 times in history where we forcibly made a culture. And it's like, nah, we do it all the time, apparently. Speaking of all the time, let's now go into who needs a visa to enter the USA. Wow, that is really, this many countries need a visa to enter the USA? How do they make that much money from tourism if everyone needs a visa? By the way, it's not actually, so you might notice, I'm glad they mentioned this, it's not actually visa-free for anyone besides Canada. Canada is the only country that can visit the US. They can go for 6 months, no ESTA required. Everyone else has to pay $14, and they have to submit that I did not commit genocide box, which I think is ridiculous, because I've paid that now 5 times. You should know I haven't committed genocide by now! America! Remember my answers, damn it! It's like it's like frustrating when you have to. It's like a website. It's like they're asking me to make a new username and password every 5 years, and it's like you can't. Or every 2 years even. It's like just remember the last time. I know you want another $14 from me, but is it worth it? And the answer to America is yes. How far from London can you get by train in 12 hours? Pretty far. Percentage of Muslim in some European countries? Wow. Okay, so this is a really unique one because I think that I would not have guessed the UK is lower than most of Western Europe. I wouldn't have guessed that Austria is the highest. I wonder, I would have guessed that because they are, the usual trend for most of my adult life has been that the places with the fewest immigrants have been the most anti-immigration. And so given that Austria has the most success with anti-immigration parties, I would have guessed they had quite a low immigration rate. But if they're at 8.4%, I mean, let's be honest, like, there are some Muslims who might be in Spain still from way back when, but I don't imagine a lot of those are, like, people who have lived there for 100 years. So that is a very, very large amount of immigration from not just one country, but like, or one place, but one culture. And yeah, I feel like this is something that might cause some interesting things across Europe, because there are a lot of ways in which that it's a clash of religions. It's a clash of like I mentioned, Europe is pretty low on religiosity, and that like we have religion, but it's like You know, like, it's not like an American style thing. But a lot of people who come from other religions treat it like it is very serious and don't understand why you would need to have a separation between church and state. I think teaching that and making sure everyone knows why is something you need to have if you're going to have multiple religions exist in one space. Speaking of multiple religions, Ukraine peace plan. As you can see, what if we had a bunch of European countries, particularly UK and EU forces, enforcing the border? That way, if Russia attacked them, they would be starting a war with NATO, would be very bad. Speaking of very bad, one flight, 2 map projections. Oh, yeah, this one's interesting. Then we've got, should Canada become the 51st state? As you can, okay, so I would have guessed immediately it's Alberta, who would have the highest yeses. Interestingly, it's very closely followed by Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and 15% in BC. And then if you look on Ontario, they're like, yeah, 11%, 12% in Quebec, 7% in the Atlantic. I think if we're being brutally honest with ourselves, if we really insist on redrawing the US-Canadian border, I think getting rid of both places isn't that logical, making one complete place. I think the more logical thing is to say, okay, so the US clearly has, the west of Canada feels way more like the west of the US, and the east of Canada feels way more like the east of the US, but specifically only like the northeast. There are like all of this area up here, like northern New York, etc. But the same with Michigan and like Minnesota. There's so many like little quirks of shared culture here. And I would say that if I would say rather than being like, let's incorporate you, how about we work out where the logical land trade is? Because Canada doesn't seem to do very much east-west trade anyway. I think you could logically cut it off at like Manitoba, maybe even Ontario, and in exchange for the 4 provinces, I think you should get 4 states. Or you should just get New York, I think. Because let's be honest, America seems to not have any love for New York. It's their largest city, but not their capital. All sorts of Americans are like, yeah, I don't like New York because I can't drive my car there. Well, I want to drive my car everywhere, and if I can't do it in specifically the most densely populated part of our country, what's even the point of owning a vehicle? Like, there's all sorts of ways in which I think Canada and New York could be a better fit for each other, and so boom, that's my business idea. Take New England and give it to the place that probably should be called New England. Okay, I think that's too many controversial ideas for one video. So let's add to another controversial idea. Here's how the Google Maps labels the Gulf of Mexico. To me, this is the biggest proof about how dumb it is. Like I'm a big believer you can choose to like American nationalists will be like, oh, you think it's dumb? Well, we are allowed to, and it's like, no, don't you see? You're focusing on this instead of focusing on all the domestic politics issues are important, all the international political issues are important, but every time you get wrapped up in a debate about this, you don't talk about that. Should you call it the Gulf? Calling it the Gulf of America is like, sure, fun idea if you want to move in that direction, but like, by just doing it and then only doing it in your country, it's just, I don't know, it's one of those things that gives up. Everyone loses like 0.1% of their, impression on the US, and the US doesn't gain anything for it, right? Like, no one actually feels better because a thing has been renamed. And that is, I think, it's the problem when you realize you can sell your international reputation for domestic political gain, because, I don't know, I guess that's a thing to worry about in general. So here's a map of the Gulf of Mexico. I also think the other side's dumb too, though. You know, okay, here's my other hot take. I think people are like, look at me, showing how it's the Gulf of Mexico. Like, okay, it's now that weird disputed Gulf. I think the easiest thing is just to ignore it, because how often do we even need to talk about the Gulf of Mexico brackets, the Gulf of America? I don't want to talk about it. I think it's the exact sort of thing that's like, every time we talk about it, America loses their ability to do one more thing, which might actually help the people who elect the people who do that. So you know what? I don't know what Gulf that is. In fact, I think Gulf is a dumb word too. You know what? Let's call it I know seas and Gulfs clearly have a difference. Let's call it the Sea of, CUM. Canada, Cuba, the United States, and Mexico. That's what I'm going to start calling it. And I think that if you believe in the world getting better, you should too. Speaking of the world getting better, here's a case of the world objectively getting worse. Google Maps has begun updating map images of Gaza. This is 91,000 upvotes. Wish it wasn't the last one today, but we'll end on a more somber note because, I think that a lot of people will point to conflict as just a way to get their, political side moved one direction or the other. But I think it's really useful as a reminder that Google Maps, for most people, seeing like into the past, is a showcase of how much better things have got. But, what might be the before and after in another country is the before and after or in another part of the world. But I think that is a really tragic reminder that, like, there are still places that existed where people had lives and families and memories that now do not exist. And I think that the most important thing that you can remember, if you can take anything from this video, is that you are very blessed that you can look at Google Maps and see progress. Even when it's dumb sideways progress, you can still see a progress of some form. But for some things, we're going to have these weird things. Well, you know, in 100 years, you'll be able to be like, oh yeah, so there's just a whole place that used to exist and sort of now doesn't. And I think it should be seen as a, oh wow, there's so many more of these than I thought. I think this should be seen as a failing on everyone's end to allow anything to get to this point, right? I think that any time that we as humans stick to our ideas so strongly, we let places be destroyed, we are doing extreme damage to the world. But maybe that's just my hot take. Maybe I should let my house be destroyed over the Gulf of America situation. Maybe you should let your like button be destroyed. I'm just kidding. I don't know why YouTubers would even want you to like the video. I'm sure it's got, like, maybe at some point it helped the algorithm. But yeah, like, if you want to actually help the algorithm on this video, you've done so by watching it all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed this week's fun little filler map thing. Big thank you to Naito for the editing on it, and I'll be back next week for some more silly filler videos. It has been a wild ride diving into this, like, do a daily video thing, because yeah, effectively you have to go full force into all sorts of issues, but yeah, it seems like people have been enjoying that as opposed to the let's do research and then a script style, because ultimately, I guess the freeform style is surprisingly fun. And I'm glad you have enjoyed this one. And if you haven't, you didn't make it to this point. So thank you for watching. Hope you all enjoyed. And I'll see you next time. Second channel, don't care. Bye. Oh, we'll do this in a month. So go to Map Porn, upvote any images you like. And hopefully we'll end on a happier note. Man, it is devastating. Yeah, I think a useful reminder to everyone out there to put reality before your political biases, and also put reality before watching 2cat videos, because I'm going to force you to do that now. Bye.